So, in the past, I've actually talked about a lot of ways in which forest carbon projects can be manipulated to get credits that are maybe not valid or get credits that represent trees that aren't there anymore or something. And most of the time, those have been separated into like separate videos that nobody watches. So I want to dump all of the ways in which people can cheat in forest carbon projects into a single list with real examples in the most clickbaity way possible, if I can. All right, so let's just start the list here. 21 different ways in which I have identified people cheating forest carbon projects. Number one, and the biggest, reference regions. Verra avoided deforestation projects make you draw a reference region that basically says, here's an analog to the project area. It was deforested this much, therefore the same thing is likely to happen inside the project area. It's the core way in which credits are issued to a project. Well, guess what? People draw reference regions that are completely unrepresentative of the project. Sometimes they're hundreds of kilometers away. Sometimes they're right next to the project, but have a completely different, type of forest or situation going on. At least 50% of Verra reference regions out there are bullshit. An independent scientist who was not me, and I've never even met the guy, estimated that thanks to this reference region manipulation, something like 73% of Verra carbon credits are nonsense. The worst I've ever seen is a project called Langua. It actually was issued about 8 times as many carbon credits as it should be because the reference region was in a completely different environment and different type of situation as the project itself. All right, going down the list. Gerrymandering. This is an American IFM problem. What this refers to in America is basically when you're drawing polygons in a way that favors your side. And it happens with carbon projects all the time. So a forest carbon project, for example, if I own a bunch of land, maybe I will only register a project in the bits of the land that favors the issuance of credits. Most often this results in people drawing the project area around areas in which the trees were already protected in some way. Maybe this is deep ravines where you couldn't access the trees. Maybe these are small islands where you couldn't actually take a boat out to get to these trees. Maybe these are trees along a road or trees along a development where people would cause a massive unholy fuss if you actually cut them down. Happens in a decent number of American IFM projects. Number 3, planting trees for timber that were already going to be planted. At least half of reforestation projects on the market are basically just timber plantations that are being planted by companies that plant timber trees all the time. You know, timber companies, they go around, they isolate land that's being sold for dirt cheap, they buy it, and they plant trees, and then they get the timber off of it. Well, some of the time they just think, oh, well, let's get some carbon as a cherry on top. If the project didn't exist and the trees were going to be planted anyway, those credits are worthless. They are not genuine offsets because that carbon was going to be removed from the atmosphere no matter what. And guess what? There's actually zero prohibitive restrictions on timber harvesting in reforestation projects. You can just plant trees like you normally would. Number 4, bogus deforestation maps. This is another Verra Red Plus problem. We see people basically using maps to claim that there wasn't any deforestation in their project that are bullshit. Maps that are made by, like the Brazilian state government or made by the project itself that are in complete disagreement with, maps that are made by academics, put out there by like NASA and the University of Maryland and other independent groups. If your estimate of deforestation doesn't agree with what everybody else thinks is happening, this is a real problem. So it happens in these Red Plus projects all the time. Number 5, fantastical harvest scenarios in IFM projects. So American IFM projects, they work by you basically drawing a scenario of how you would have harvested these trees if the carbon project didn't exist. Obviously, people always say that they would have clear-cut all the trees. Well, that just doesn't make sense. There are many parts of the United States where clear-cutting just isn't the favored practice. If you cut down all the trees, they're not going to grow back. So you'll never find like a massive clear-cut in like Vermont. And yet people make these claims all the time. And here's a case. This is the case of recreational ski slopes claiming they would have clear-cut their land. Absolutely ridiculous. So we find all kinds of fantastical harvest scenarios that are developed using like the forest vegetation simulator that are just not realistic to the landscape. Number 6, plant trees on land that used to be native rainforest. Believe it or not, I've caught this happening a couple times. Can you imagine cutting down native rainforest, releasing all that CO2 in the atmosphere, taking the timber, and then going and planting trees and getting carbon credits for it? Well, it's not supposed to be allowed, but I've found some gold standard projects that allow it. And there isn't even a Verra project that, even though it's prohibited, they just lied. They just lied and they did it anyway. Guess what? If you use some satellite imagery, you can figure out if that actually happened. Here's another Verra Red Plus one. Just don't verify. Something's gone wrong with your project, mass deforestation, Well, just don't re-verify it. According to Verra's protocols, you're supposed to re-verify every 5 years. People don't necessarily have to do that. Here's an example of a project that's been completely deforested. The last verification was in 2015. They've been getting exemptions due to COVID for the last 2 years. They might just never re-verify again. It may just fall off the grid as a dark project. They'll either wait until the deforestation stops and they can start getting credits again, or they just won't re-verify. Here's an extremely common one for American IFM projects. Enroll already protected land. A massive chunk of American improved forest management projects are taking place on land that's already owned by conservation organizations. I'm always ripping on the Nature Conservancy for this. If the land was already protected, then you're not actually protecting trees with these carbon credits. These carbon credits are therefore going to stop pollution that is real, even though they're protecting trees that weren't actually at risk. Happens all the time. Here's another reforestation one. Reforestation is really hard. It really is. It involves going back out into the fields like every year for 3 or 4 years, constant maintenance of these little saplings, and it can go bad. You know, a bad drought, a bad hurricane, and so there are instances of reforestation projects that just were not successful. The trees did not take off. Well, what are you going to do about that? You spent the last 10 years working on this project trying to make it work. You better believe you're going to fudge the numbers to make sure that you get your credits. And you're doing this, of course, so that you can actually replant the trees, so you can get your credits in the future. At least that's what you say. Here's another Verra one. We got another red plus avoided deforestation one. Things going bad inside your project? Lots of deforestation going on? Well, how about you just change your project area after the fact? Believe it or not, I've encountered avoided deforestation projects that either change their project area or only verify certain parts of their project. So they're literally only picking the areas that they were successful at conserving. So they didn't stop deforestation at all. The situation's just getting worse and worse and worse. They're just walking back their claims and still getting credit issuance for the whole time. It's absolutely crazy. All right, we're up to number 11. Here's the technical one. You need to actually somehow go from having a tree to estimating how much carbon is actually being stored. Well, we use allometric and growth equations to do that. Basically, it goes from a field measurement of the tree up to an estimate of how much carbon that is actually being stored inside the tree. Well, people will use all kinds of bunk equations sometimes, and I've seen this being called out before. And it depends on the protocol. It's not the biggest issue. It doesn't usually happen. I've never seen it happen in the US, for example. You're even allowed in some protocols to create your own equations, which is, of course, a massive conflict of interest because you're going to create a carbon equation that predicts that there's a ton of carbon inside those trees. All right, we're up to number 12. How would you... We're back to reforestation. Let's say you're planting trees. What if you just don't happen to keep track of where you planted the trees? Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Well, guess what? There are some mega Verra reforestation projects that literally have no idea where they planted the trees. How does the verification work? Well, they pile somebody up into a truck and they drive around, from property to property, and they just trust that all the other trees are just being planted properly. So there's no way to actually independently verify with a satellite whether or not those trees exist. There's not even a way to actually go around to every single property and measure those trees. They're only taking a subsample when they verify. Absolutely ridiculous. And we're back to avoided deforestation. What happens if there's a ton of deforestation in your project? Well, you could fess up to it. Another thing you could do is change your baseline. Make your baseline look worse than it actually was initially. That way, maybe there's been way more deforestation than you anticipated was going to happen, but your baseline, it turns out it was way more aggressive the whole time. You're still worth credits. Verra allows you to change your baseline every 10 years, and if something's going wrong in your project, you better believe that's going to take place. Here's one that affects all project types. Sometimes they just don't tell you what's going on inside the project. You know, there's a certain minimal amount of documentation that you're supposed to make public with these kind of things. But some people just don't. Sometimes the files just don't get uploaded. A lot of the time the geometry isn't there, so you really don't know where they're actually planting trees. One of the more severe cases that I've ever seen is an American IFM project where they've literally, like the CIA, blacked out every single thing inside the document. Well, thanks. That's doing everybody a lot of good. I have a lot of faith in your project now. Here's a common one. Protect trees that aren't actually at risk. Now, I know I already talked about trees that were already under a conservation easement, but with Verra avoided deforestation projects, a lot of the time these trees weren't at risk to begin with. You know, there are cases of avoided deforestation projects taking place in untouchable mountain ranges with no road access, taking place in deep within the Amazon, where you'd have to hike in for a week in order to get to these areas. It's absolutely ridiculous, and it's quite common across both IFM and avoided deforestation project types. We're up to number 16. What are avoided conversion projects? Well, in a normal project, you have to kind of model a baseline using a little bit of data. But avoided conversion projects, some of them you're actually able just to say, these trees were going to get cut down, and we protected them. Well, you know, sometimes this works, and sometimes I find this to be completely plausible, but other times, all you need is word of mouth. So all you might need is somebody to sign off on a document that says they were going to cut those trees down. Maybe it's a local corrupt official, maybe it's a timber company. Whatever it is, it's extremely low bar to pass if all you're relying on is word of mouth to claim that you're protecting these trees. Here's a ridiculous one. We're up to number 17. A lot of Verra avoided deforestation projects don't actually measure how much carbon is in their forest. Yeah, I mean, some of them do. Some of them they're actually sending out plots and measuring the trees and stuff like they should. But some of them just take regional averages. And of course, I've come across projects that are taking place in like high alpine tundra where there's like barely any trees, using regional averages that have way higher carbon than the actual project itself. If they're not actually measuring the amount of carbon either in the field or using like some sort of LiDAR, then the whole project is bogus. You have no idea how much carbon there actually is. All right, we're up to 18. I don't know if this is actually cheating, but a lot of projects really downplay their fire risk. And American IFM projects, I think, are particularly guilty of this. You know, there's a lot of American IFM projects that are taking place in forests that are basically timber boxes. You know, all these projects that are in like Northern California, Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, these places are gonna burn down. A lot of these projects are 30 years, 100 years. You really think after 100 years of climate change, a lot of these like ponderosa pine forests aren't gonna burn to ash? I mean, it's just a sad fact that a lot of the American West is drying up. It's not just an American problem overall. So what's happened with a lot of these protocols is that they actually over-penalize projects that aren't at fire risk, and they under-penalize projects that are at fire risk. Let's be honest, you probably should not be buying forest carbon from a project that's ponderosa pine in high desert that's experiencing like a 30-year drought. This is just common sense. All right, we're back to the technicals here. And again, of course, back to Verra avoided deforestation projects. Once again, you have to basically model a baseline and say what would have happened. Well, you take your reference region and you say what happened in that reference region. But it's not a one-to-one correlation. You have to basically draw a model. You can draw a model basically by drawing a linear line of what deforestation rates were over time, or you can use like a sigmoidal curve. Well, either way, these models are basically unconstrained. And they basically lead you to the conclusion that the entire area is going to be deforested by some amount of time. This is obviously pretty problematic if you're talking about an area that is, otherwise inaccessible. The idea that the whole place is going to be deforested by, in the next 30 or 40 years, it's crazy. It's just not realistic. All right, we've made it to 20. We got another technical one. This is one that was actually written up by Carbon Plan. Basically, the way that a particular protocol works, put out there by CARB, the California Air Resources Board, is that there are baseline numbers throughout the United States. And so, like, the majority of California has a single number that you use to decide what the baseline of your project is going to be. Well, depending on where you put your project in California, you can really manipulate that number. If you put your project in an area that has a lot more carbon than the average of this particular part of California happens to be basically desert, then you're going to get a lot more carbon credits. And so people have been manipulating where they can put their projects within these kind of fixed areas. A lot of people often ask, why can't you just use a simple number? Why can't you just go with like a regional average? Why can't you make it simple? This is why. Because you can just manipulate that too. We need to have a more well thought out approach. Number 21. Do you know what it's going to be? I had a whole video on this. It's about hiding your credits on a blockchain. Yeah, there are a couple of blockchains out there, including the one by that scammy WeWork guy, in which they basically take crappy carbon credits, throw them on a blockchain, don't tell you which ones are which. They're recycling them in like a money laundering scheme, and then you buy the credits on the blockchain. And that way, if you buy a credit on the blockchain, nobody actually knows whether or not it came from a project that's crap. Now, the majority of the projects that they're buying are crap, so it's almost certain that you did get a carbon credit that's crap, but there's no real way for you to know. So there you go. That's all 21 points. I will probably think of more as soon as I stop recording this, but they are now dumped out there for the public consumption. And this doesn't necessarily indicate that we need to give up on carbon projects in general, but it does indicate that the protocols that exist today are basically Swiss cheese. They are filled with holes. They're really problematic. The people making the protocols are downright horrible. And we really need to come up with an airtight set of protocols in which people can't manipulate the system. Because forests, they're still kind of the only way out of the situation that they're in. There's no other solution out there that can scale to the gigaton level as quickly as forests can. So we really need to rethink this entire system, tear the system down, and push back enormously on all the cheaters and all the protocol developers out there right now.